Bonjour tout le monde. Alors, je vais faire aujourd'hui l'animation pour le breakout session qui s'appelle Shifting Dast Left, qui va être présenté aujourd'hui par Stan Wisseman. Donc, Stan dirige l'équipe de stratèges en sécurité pour CyberRes de Microfocus en Amérique du Nord. Il a plus de 30 ans d'expérience en sécurité de l'information et a intégré la sécurité dans différents produits, systèmes, logiciels et entreprises. Avant de rejoindre Microfocus, qui s'appelait anciennement HP en 2014, Stan a occupé le poste de responsable de la sécurité de l'information pour Fannie Mae, avec des responsabilités en matière de sécurité de l'information et de résilience au sein de l'organisation. En ce qui concerne l'AppSec, Stan a lancé le chapitre Nova de l'OWASP, a coprésidé aussi un comité pour l'initiative DHS Build Security et a dirigé aussi des pratiques de conseil en sécurité logicielle et a aidé à lancer le programme de sécurité des applications chez Fannie Mae. Alors aujourd'hui, la présentation Shifting Dast Left, qui est une expression que les développeurs de logiciels connaissent bien et qui signifie tester les défauts plus tôt dans le processus de développement du logiciel. Malheureusement, le rapport entre les développeurs et les membres de l'équipe AppSec est assez élevé. On parle d'environ 100 pour 1, selon certaines estimations. Cela crée une situation où l'assurance qualité teste déjà les défauts. Alors, pourquoi ne pas désigner les vulnérabilités de sécurité comme une autre catégorie de défauts? Donc, pour y parvenir, votre programme de sécurité des applications doit avoir 3 attributs clés qui sont l'intégration, l'automatisation et l'agilité. Donc, rejoignez-nous aujourd'hui, maintenant, dans ce webinaire pour apprendre comment construire un programme de sécurité des applications qui soit intégré de manière transparente à vos chaînes d'outils Devops. Donc, Stan, qui est stratège en sécurité chez CyberRes, partagera ses conseils sur la manière de réaliser un véritable processus automatisé de tests de sécurité qui s'appelle Shift Left. Stan, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. Again, I'm Stan Wisseman, and I'll be talking to you today about a topic of mine that I find very interesting, which is how we can shift dynamic application security testing left. But before we dive into the primary topic today, I'd like to remind folks of our top-level messaging. CyberRes, which is a micro-focused line of business, is focused on helping organizations achieve the desired business outcomes that they're seeking and helping them become more cyber resilient. We have an industry-leading portfolio covering everything from data privacy and protection to identity access management, security operations, and what we're here to talk about today, application security. And to learn more about how we at CyberRes can help organizations achieve these outcomes, please visit cyberres.com. So first, let us begin with what's happening with development. You know, we know that there's a huge digital transformation going on, which has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, and it's making us more reliant on digital services. The transformation requires an accelerated delivery of applications and new functionality. So that's something that we try to achieve through our software development practices. And that's why, with development teams going rapidly to more agile and DevOps processes, we're seeing a lot more frequent code deployments occur. It enables them to not only do greater code deployments, but also, it has a much faster commit time. And, there's a lot of benefits to this. If you look at, for example, the recovery time associated with applications now, it's a much faster recovery time. The challenge, though, is that this increased velocity of development also can result in more exposures in production. Now, I've been doing information security since the early 80s, and I certainly have seen the transitions go between what the primary target, and there are many years where the infrastructure was, without a doubt, the primary target for attackers. And when I first got into software or application security in the early 2000s, it was a hard sell because many of the fundamentals associated with the infrastructure weren't in place for a lot of organizations. And the focus at the time was really on the network layer and the infrastructure weaknesses that were there and available for potential attack. But the threat actors of today have learned that the application layer is one of the best targets for exploit. So sure, they'll take advantage of insecurely configured or unpatched infrastructure components, but many times bad actors now take advantage of weaknesses that are appearing at the application layer. Back to the DevOps challenge. There's no cookie cutter approach to integrating in application security testing. Sorry. And the dev tool chains vary by organizations, and the target state processes vary, whether it's putting in testing tools into the hands of developers and or having some kind of centralized service model. Integrating in security testing into DevOps can and is being done. It's just, you know, how it'll work for you. And certainly a couple of the approaches that we're seeing used consistently are integrating in static code analysis as well as dynamic application security testing. Both are proven techniques, but they have some challenges as far as how you can do this. But first, let's talk about these different techniques. You can look at it as an inside-out approach as well as an outside-in to application security testing. And no two types of testing, and these are included, are created equal. They are all designed with a different area of focus, along with the various speeds and costs associated with them. In fact, you know, we recommend strongly that you use a multiple technique approach when you're assessing the risks of an application. Static code analysis is an inside-out approach. It provides better code coverage and identification of root causes. And dynamic analysis, or outside in, it does a simulation of a real-world attack of a running application. And static and dynamic testing play different roles. You know, in that static testing, you can conduct very early on in the life cycle, as soon as you have code that can compile, and you can look at it from a static perspective, and that's great. But static testing can create a long list of possible issues. And whereas with dynamic, you have environment involved, and it's running against a real application server, and you are actually pumping data out of the server. And so you know that when you have found a vulnerability, it's exploitable. And one thing that Dast provides that static application security testing can't, it's completely independent of an application, and you can see it in a live view. You immediately find exploitable vulnerabilities. You get a false positive rate with Dast scanning, because a low false positive rate with Dast scanning, because you're injecting real known attacks into an application, and we can see if we're getting data back out of that application. That's an exploitable vulnerability or not. So not only do you get quick feedback, you get very accurate feedback. But we also encourage the concept of layered security testing. And so we need to look at the vulnerabilities early and remediate early. But if something isn't caught in static testing or isn't prioritized for remediation at that point, you can then catch it dynamically. And if weaknesses aren't caught there, that's why you still have penetration testing, which is, you know, more of a manual effort. Now, whether or not you can fit penetration testing into a DevOps lifecycle, that's a whole nother question. But there's value in augmenting these other automated testing techniques to try to find these other vulnerabilities. But that's why we need these layers. And when you deploy, that's when you need to bring in that more of a complete risk associated with that and look at that in an operating environment, and sometimes test additionally with pen testing. So now that we've covered that, why is Dast important? And why is it needed for a comprehensive program? And more importantly, for this talk, how can we shift dynamic application security testing left? Because by shifting Dast left, we get a whole lot of value. The earlier we can do testing, this is generally true, the earlier we can do testing, the better. So it's important for Dast tools to have the ability to crawl modern frameworks, whether that's a traditional app, a single page application, doing API testing. And if you can't crawl it, if you can't get to parts of the application, then you aren't going to be able to test with dynamic application security testing. And so and find those exploitable vulnerabilities. So security DevOps at scale is critical, and I'll be speaking more about that in a moment. And I've talked about how Dast complements SAS, and of course you don't need to have source code when you're doing dynamic testing like you do with static code analysis. So that's another big difference. But Dast does work well in DevOps. Once the application is in an active state, and it can be stood up on a server, you can begin integration testing. You can really start looking at the environment factors of an application. And while static application security analysis is really great method for looking at code level, it's unaware of these environmental factors. That's really where dynamic scanning can take advantage of that. So the dynamic application scanning security testing tool that we have is called Fortify Web Inspect, which is available on-prem or through our Fortify on Demand as a service model. We have all the latest security standards, PCI, STIG, NIST, ISO, and HIPAA. While the OWASP Top 10 isn't a standard, many organizations do leverage it in their metrics, and we can certainly provide reports based on the OWASP Top 10. Web Inspect covers all the top 10 that dynamic can cover, and we try to cover all the standards that are relevant in this space and give you the reporting that you need. The ability to scan applications at scale and integrating in with DevOps is really important. As I mentioned a moment ago, gone are the days where you can have a dedicated set of analysts just sitting in front of a testing tool. Testing needs to be integrated in with the processes and the pipelines these days. Web Inspect has been re-engineered for enterprise scalability. If you recall the history of Web Inspect, it got started on the order of 20 years ago, and it was initially for independent tester of an application. And we have completely changed the model to enable the enterprise to leverage Web Inspect at scale and spin up and as many instances as possible. You can do anything through the UI that you need to, also through the API without additional tooling. And of course, being able to shift left is very important. That's one of the things we'll continue to talk about. And then there's the reporting into a centralized platform. So, if you get all of our results from multiple tests, in the Fortify portfolio, we have Software Security Center, or SSC, and the Fortify on Demand portal, where we can pull that data in from both SAS and Dast tests into one platform and give you the chance to understand any kind of correlation where you can actually see the results together. We're seeing developer-driven Dast testing expand, extending the use of Fortify Dast outside of the typical application security or QA function, and fully integrating that into the development CI/CD pipelines and automating that pipeline. And this is only possible because of the incremental improvements that we've made and enhancements the Fortify team has made to Web Inspect over the last few years. Now, the comprehensive coverage of Dast scanning is an important attribute of this type of testing. A reflection of how Web Inspect has improved is the attainment of our 5.0 or perfect score from a 2020 Gartner Magic Quadrant for AppSec testing for Dast, a pretty big achievement. And it's, we do want to provide, emphasize the importance that the environment has on the application, and dynamic scans can test that. We can access the application and the environment that it's running in. And one of the first tests that you can do that in, you can't get the environmental aspects from a static scan. So the ability to run a SQL injection test with actual backend database, and it gives you that a much different view than a static test, because you'll actually get the results from the database and validate that it truly is vulnerable to a SQL injection type of attack, those kind of things. You may, conclude that it's possible to obtain data this way where you can't with a SAS test. The other thing that you need to be aware of, when you do a dynamic test, there may be other mitigating controls in place. And so if you're running your dynamic test in a lower environment, non-production environment, you may not have the same kind of mitigating controls in production. But then if you do have hours in the production site that you can run that have all those controls, then that gives you a greater confidence as to whether or not those controls are working or not. Things like SSL attacks and looking at network layers that aren't available for a static test that you can do in the dynamic testing. And as for APIs, APIs expand the exploitable attack surface and are really a growing concern that we're seeing from our customers. API collaboration tools can be used to provide input to Fortify Web Inspect. We can use Postman as an example as a way of getting more information about the APIs and feeding that to Web Inspect for a fuller analysis of the exposed APIs. In fact, while we're working together with these API tools, vulnerability scanning of APIs can be better achieved and easier than some of the traditional web applications that we've done. Another consideration is how do you cope with authenticated APIs? They can get quite complex in modern applications, and Web Inspect capabilities now have been evolved to be able to handle these kind of use cases with more complex authentications. A lot of time we get asked about the role of Dast testing with support of penetration testing. And I've mentioned before that penetration testing does have a role in some cases. And many times, pen testing is a great tool to test your apps, but do you really want to have your pen testers focused on the low-hanging fruit or the things that you can identify with a Dast test? And it's much more efficient if they have a tool like this available to them. It can do a lot of the legwork for the penetration testers. And honestly, again, going back to the challenge of DevOps and the speed aspect, having a manual pen test injected in there sometimes is a real challenge because how much time it really takes. So you may not have the opportunity to do it as often as you'd like. So you can substitute for this manual method by using this dynamic testing. And we actually provide hacker level insights that allow users to find these client-side frameworks and version numbers and making it capable of, what's potentially capable for 0 days findings. Fortify on Demand Dynamic Plus, for example, actually simulates a penetration test. So you can actually take advantage of some of the things you normally would pay a pen test team to do with the services that we have available today. So we've talked a lot about the value of Dast and the difference between Dast and SAS. That's great. But let's talk about what we mean when we're talking about shifting Dast left, which is the topic of today's topic of webinar, right? So what does that really mean? Now, early in the SDLC, software development lifecycle, that you can start out, the better. And in the beginning, you're really dealing with requirements and design. And that's where you're looking at security architecture reviews, potentially threat modeling. Again, in the context of DevOps, some of that isn't as relevant as it used to be, but you're doing all you can looking at misuse and abuse cases, or how you can actually do things with the applications you otherwise wouldn't anticipate, the non-happy path, as it were. But there's not a lot of tooling going on at that part in the life cycle. But you can still apply security best practices and avoid gross exposures. And the application of security principles at this early phase certainly pays dividends later on, as you think about what you're doing in your application, least privilege being an example of that. Then you start writing code. And this is when we'll pull in your static code analysis. You get more fine-grained security perspective on what the application is really doing by reviewing the software versus what is in the requirements or a design, assuming you have those assets. And we aren't quite to the point where we can do dynamic testing at this point. We need an active server to actually run the dynamic test against. And it's really when the code is available for deployment in a pre-prod and testing way, that's when you'll be able to shift Dast left. And as soon as that app is ready for QA, or that phase, it's time to start thinking about dynamic security testing. Along with all the other acceptance testing and security testing that should be initiated, again, the earlier we can find the security defect, the cheaper it is to fix. Now, deployments come in many different flavors. Devops deployments is certainly very popular right now. You have automated builds, you have automated deployments into different stage servers, test, pre-release, production. And at this point, we can initiate Dast scans and get results from them. And historically, Dast was more of a stage gate model. And that was when you finished QA and we are ready to move into acceptance testing and push into production. A security test would be conducted to make sure no critical vulnerabilities will be exposed, and will then be able to move to the next gate. And many times there are vulnerabilities found that would require the development or operating environment to be fixed, and that would delay the push to production, not making very many people very happy when you have that kind of hard gate and decision. But depending on the criticality, they have to make that call. Therefore, we can move, now we can move Dast actually left of QA and even earlier, and it's a lot less painful for everyone if you can actually shift that security testing left as opposed to right before you go to prod. And by catching those vulnerabilities earlier, you don't have to make the difficult decision of missing a commitment to ship versus fixing a critical security defect. And do you have to accept that risk of something going into prod with a known critical vulnerability? And if testing had been completed earlier and you had discovered it then, it would have been taken care of in the normal processes of development without escalation and the drama just prior to pushing into prod. So that's the advantage of having it left, and that's where we're starting to see a number of organizations doing it. We know that that defects are part of life and development. This shows that 42% of firms have reported that they've experienced exploits due to software vulnerabilities. I mean, that's just a reality. These security defects are being exploited. So decisions have to be made as to whether to bring the app down due to remediation needs to fix those vulnerabilities, or potentially inconveniencing customers or processes. And also we see here that a third of these exploits are coming through the web application interface. And so part of the reasons that we want to do additional testing earlier is to avoid this situation, because you can see that if they knew about these vulnerabilities, they made the decision to go ahead and push it out into prod. And again, the result is those web apps are getting exploited. And so, the earlier you do Dast testing, you're actually buying time. And by testing earlier, you don't need to reorient your entire development process to at a late stage gate like before. And catching these things early, making it a normal part of the process, makes things easier and cheaper and brings more stability to the development process. And that's something we're all looking for. Now, Scan Central Dast is a platform that we came out with at Fortify about a year ago. We're really trying to take a lot of these ideas that we've just talked about and really simplify them. Dynamic scanning can fit in wherever it needs to be included, as long as you meet those preconditions I just talked about. And ideally, that's the CI/CD pipeline is where you want it. And even a step before that, having developers initiate scans themselves. And Scan Central is a scalable architecture that the Fortify team has worked hard to make DevOps friendly and provide simplified licensing. And Scan Central worked within Software Security Center, or SSC, which is our aggregation tool for on-prem. SSC gives you a single pane of glass where you can look at static and dynamic results together, as I mentioned before. We can look for overlaps and where vulnerabilities exist and help you prioritize, and actually watch them throughout the development process from version to version and stage to stage. So SSC is a great platform for tracking that type of data. So we wanted to do, what we wanted to do is provide a plugin within the context of SSC that was really targeting at dynamic scanning and the needs of somebody managing dynamic scanning. And this is a platform that allows onboarding of an application and scheduling scans for an app and setting limits on scan parameters. And all this is through a Dockerized deployment. So you can have multiple sensors, which is what we call the actual scanning units within Scan Central. And from a priority perspective, you set the priority on how the applications are scanned. You can take those configured scans and we can apply them to sensors and get the results. And we can then push into SSC for review, comparison, for tracking, and for looking at history and trends and things like that. So again, we're trying to make it simple and use this single pane of glass as a way of getting that information to you. We've introduced features in Scan Central Dast that enable horizontal scaling through multiple containerized versions of Web Inspect, so we can parallel process JavaScript and other activities. This feature allows you to scan very large applications in a fraction of the time, which enables integration into CI/CD pipelines and shifting left. Web Inspect has augmented these speed improvements with ease of use enhancements, such as automated configuration for single page applications and auto-generated login macros. We want to integrate Scan Central in where it makes the most sense for whoever may be kicking off scans in DevOps. Anything that can be done in Scan Central through the UI can be done through the API as well. We have some pre-configured options. We have an Azure DevOps plugin, so scans can be easily kicked off by Azure pipelines. The Jenkins plugin can be leveraged with the normal build process, so dynamic scans can be part of that too. You can set thresholds and things like that on it to fail builds if you want to. If there are critical issues that you didn't want the application to move forward, the build can fail. Or if you want, you can allow it to move forward and continue if you're like in an early stage of testing. So QA can take a look at it if they're downstream from the security test. But early feedback and keeping that feedback loop going is one of the advantages of this approach. An example of how we can support Dast shifting left, another example of that is our new functional application security testing, or FAST proxy. FAST provides a CI/CD friendly way to capture traffic from any functional testing system and send it to Fortify's Scan Central Dast solution for targeted, agile Dast scanning. You can now leverage existing QA testing scripts to operate highly targeted web inspect scans and easily integrate these scans into the CI/CD pipeline. FAST also is good as an alternative to a passive IaaS, an interactive application security test. With passive IaaS, you have to re-instrument your application server, something most operations teams frown upon. And by using a FAST proxy in the same way you'd use a passive IaaS solution, you can reuse all of your functional tests, and scan against your app without involving the operations teams. Additionally, Web Inspect can continue that initial crawling and find all the things your functional tests didn't exercise. You're not solely limited by the person creating the test and what they thought of, as you would be in a passive IaaS. So again, if you think about trying to mitigate some of the concerns of how long security tests take, and let's face it, if you're crawling a full web application, that can take a lot of time depending how rigorous your scan is. And by taking advantage of the FAST proxy, you can really reduce the scan time and focus on those things that are currently being worked on by your developers, and just take advantage of the scripts they're already writing. And so I think this is a great advantage as far as how you can fit Web Inspect scans into your DevOps process, and again, keep up with the speed and velocity of DevOps. So, why are static and dynamic, which already complement each other as far as different kinds of testing, and layering dynamic analysis on top of static analysis, you do gain a valuable additional risk metric, which allows you to see the application and the environment in a much more real-world kind of picture. How do you prioritize the vulnerabilities that you want to remediate? If you look at static testing results, those are usually legit issues that we need to consider. However, there's usually a question as to the likelihood of the findings being exploitable. And you don't really have that question with dynamic. With dynamic findings, we know that this is exploitable because we've been able to exercise it. And now the severity of a dynamic finding could be reduced based on other mitigating controls that are in place in the production environment. So for example, we may be testing in a pre-prod environment, and we know that production has things like a WAF in place. But again, has that WAF been configured properly, and can it get bypassed? And so there are considerations as far as the environment that you're running your test in. You don't want to impact prod by doing a dynamic test and impact customers, but at the same time, you can't necessarily assume that all those controls are working properly either. So you may want to run it occasionally in those kind of environments with proper safeguards. We do want consistency, when we're looking at vulnerability findings and reporting, and you can get that with Fortify because we're having the same vulnerability categorization, and you can talk apples to apples when you're looking at static as well as dynamic tests. And that's very critical because teams can get very confused by the different terminology and criticality assignments that are giving vulnerabilities from different vendors. There may be certain service-specific exploits, but again, at the end of the day, if you're looking at the results of a dynamic test, you have higher confidence that it's going to be exploitable. SAS and Dast together can provide a continuous feedback loop of how things are moving through your SDLC, and we're seeing vulnerabilities statistically, statically, and now they're making it into pre-prod. Are they getting there? Are they getting remediated before they get to the dynamic phase of testing? Are we fixing them? And the earlier feedback we get and we see the trends going the right direction, the better. So again, that feedback loop of we found something in code, they said they remediated it, well, we did find it later, so hey, something's wrong here. We have to address it in our processes. So, in summary, software is a major differentiator for business. It's part of the transformation that we're seeing, and a number of the applications and releases are exploding. Security is perceived as adding friction. Application security programs need to be able to be nimble and to adapt, and we need to be able to inject the right kind of testing in to these DevOps and Agile development processes without adding friction. We need to be seamless. And to do that, we need to be able to shift left, and shifting dynamic application security testing left is key. That helps us manage application security risks without being impacting the speed of development, and building security in from the start, and providing that real-world feedback when they need it. We need to be able to do this in a fast and accurate way, automating scans and providing results in minutes to the developers. And again, that's where something like the fast proxy is critical to give them timely results. And we need to be able to reduce and eliminate, as many false positives as possible. That's where dynamics testing is key, because that is a very accurate level of findings back to the development team. And we need to be able to scale. If you think about the number of releases, the number of applications that are out there right now, you need to have an approach that can scale and run scans simultaneously using different approaches, whether it be enabling the developers or a centralized approach. But you need to be able to, reduce that risk of letting applications run out because you can't scale your program adequately. I do want to hit upon a few Fortify resources that are available. Again, this is the complete platform and suite of products we have that has the static code analyzer, web inspect, Fortify on demand that has both SaaS, Dast, and mobile. Software Security Center, which is for our on-prem management station. We have integration with Sonatype, as well as other OSS tool vendors, but we have a tight integration with Sonatype. And then we have our RAS product with Application Defender. We have a very active channel on YouTube called Fortify Unplugged. You'll find all kinds of different videos, including a whole bunch on web inspect and dynamic application security testing. So I encourage you to check that out. And so at that point, I'm going to wrap up. And please let me know if you have any questions. You can reach out to me and ask. I won't be able to be available at this time at the moment, but I'll be available later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stan, for this excellent presentation. Malheureusement, Stan n'a pas pu rester avec nous pour la période de questions. Et effectivement, je n'en vois pas beaucoup non plus dans la fenêtre de chat. Cependant, ce que je vous recommande fortement de faire, c'est d'aller dans le menu partenaire. Si vous regardez en haut du site, vous avez un menu, il y a une option partenaire. Choisissez partenaire, vous allez avoir la liste de tous les participants. Cliquez sur Microfocus, vous allez atteindre une page dans laquelle vous allez pouvoir poser vos questions et quelqu'un de Microfocus va vous répondre. Donc, je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir été présent dans cette présentation. J'espère que ça vous a apporté énormément sur Shifting Dast Left, sur le Shift Left. En tout cas, moi, j'ai appris énormément et je vous souhaite une bonne continuation pour le restant de la journée. Merci beaucoup et au revoir.